thanks to Southeast Cask. For today's seminar, I am really thrilled to introduce Mike Osland. So Mike is a research ecologist at the USGS's Wetland and Aquatic Research Center. His research program is quite broad, but there's a real focus on wetland ecosystems, especially at this interface between land and ocean. So a lot of mangrove work and different kind of coastal wetland areas. It includes a diverse range of topics from kind of your general ecology through to your global change biology, ecology, climate change science, plant ecology, restoration, among many others, one of which is tropicalization, which is the primary theme of Mike's talk. Thank you so much for joining us. The virtual floor is yours. You can go ahead and take it over.
Okay, thank you, Brett. Can you hear me?
Can hear you. Yep.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for the invitation, and also for organizing this network. All right. So the title for my talk is Range Expansion of Tropical Invasive Plants Due to Warming Winters. And here's an outline. I'm gonna begin with a background section that focuses on tropicalization in general and the ecological role of winter temperature extremes in our region in the southeastern United States. And then I'm going to transition to a study that's focused specifically on Brazilian pepper. And then in the last section, I'm going to describe a recent study. It's from a paper that's currently in review. The title is Range Expansion of Tropical Invasive Plants Due to Warming Winters. And my co-authors on that study are Bogdan Kabui, Laura Feher, Leah Dale, Dia Lawrence, Wes Daniel, and Jessica Spencer. And so for the background portion, I'm going to be talking, a lot of the information comes from this review paper that was published in Global Change Biology a few years ago, entitled Tropicalization of Temperate Ecosystems in North America. And then some of it is going to draw from this early 2013 paper on mangroves and mangrove range expansion. So here's a figure that sums up the tropicalization concept. And so this is a map of minimum temperatures across North America. And by minimum temperature, I mean the absolute coldest temperature that occurred across a 30-year period. So the events that I'm going to be talking about in this presentation are extreme winter temperature events. They don't occur every winter. They may occur once every 20, 30 years. They're these really, really cold events. A good example would be the freeze event that occurred in our region over Christmas of this year. But the events that I'm going to be talking about are much colder than that. So this map shows the tropical temperate transition zone. And so the warm colors show areas that have tropical cold sensitive species. And the blue colors are areas where those tropical cold sensitive species tend to not persist. And so that transition zone that I'm referring to throughout this talk is really highlighted in this map in the transition from warm to blue colors. And the photos in this figure are some of the species that were highlighted in this review. They include plants, they include insects, amphibians, reptiles, manatees, sea turtles, all sorts of different organisms. There are a lot of tropical cold sensitive organisms in this transition zone whose northern range limits are governed. They're dictated by these extreme cold events. And so they tend to expand and contract in response to these cold events. So here's a figure that highlights the frequency of these events. And so on the left, there are some photos of some of the ecological impacts. And so one is of a iguana in South Florida that's been stunned by chilling temperatures. Another is a photo of cold stunned sea turtles in North Florida. There's a fish kill, and then there's ice on an orange tree. These are some photos to convey the type of events that I'm talking about. So in some of these events, the organisms could just be damaged or stunned. In other events that are extreme enough, they could result in mass mortality. So landscape scale mass mortality. And on the right, I have a figure that was based upon data from a station in Central Florida. And so this is not for a specific species, it's just conceptual to get this point across. The take-home message from this figure is that our average winters are fairly mild in our region, but every now and then we get a cold event once out of 20, 30 years that results in damage or mortality. And so in this figure, we have a threshold line, and then the gray zone is the zone of cold damage or mortality. And the red is the return interval of these events. Along the x-axis, we have minimum temperature. And as you can see, for this specific station, temperatures around -6 occur once every 20 years. And then the blue line refers to the number of years with that temperature. And so the peak for this location, on average, the minimum temperature during a winter would be around -2. But every now and then, there's temperatures that dip into the -6, -7, -8 degrees C. And those are the events that result in the damage and mortality that I'm going to be talking about. And they're the events that govern the northern range limit of these species. Okay, so in thinking about the potential for range expansion, here's a real general figure that has 4 panels. The top panel is the recent minimum temperature. So that's the minimum temperature between 1980 and 2009. And the +2, +4, and +6 degrees C panels are just increases above that recent 30-year period. And it's just a way to visualize the potential for range expansion in the region. So this is the position of the climatic zones, not specific species, under these +2, +4, and +6 degree scenarios. And I'm going to show a lot of figures like that throughout the talk. Okay, so one thing to remember is that not all species will be able to move with climate change. And here are some alternative range expansion pathways. There are 4 in this figure. The A is a pathway that includes steps. And so an example of that would be a species that's transported long distances by humans potentially, or is able to disperse long distance due to some extreme event like a hurricane. And this is a species that can travel long distances due to that event or due to that human-mediated transport, but then isn't able to move much beyond that. And so that results in these steps. And there are some examples of that. There's a frog that is transported that way and it's spread throughout the Southeast in ornamental plants. That would be a good example of A. B is a continuous range expansion, and that's unlikely for a lot of species. We don't expect it to be just this consistent rate, this constant rate that's continuous through time. C is an expansion and contraction pathway, and we see that for a lot of species in our region where they expand during freeze-free decades and then contract and then expand again. So mangroves are a good example of that. Mangroves have experienced this expansion and contraction over the last 100 years and even longer. And then D is another common example. This would be an example of a species that isn't able to expand. So it's, even though climate change may result in suitable habitat northward of its range, it's just not able to get there and expand into those areas. So that's a very common pathway as well. So these pathways are important to consider in terms of range expansion. So I'm going to be talking about a lot of species, especially towards the end of the talk. And they're species that are governed by cold events and may have the potential to expand in the future, but they're going to require these biological processes that would enable the expansion. All right, so I got started on this line of work with mangroves. And so mangroves are really a really striking example of what I'm going to be talking about. And so I'm going to spend some time talking about mangroves before I move into invasive species. And so in our region, we have 2 types of tidal saline wetlands in general. We have salt marshes, which are very common in the areas to the north of the green on this map. The green is the mangrove distribution. And it's these extreme cold events that govern the northern range limit of mangroves. So to the north of mangroves, coastal wetlands are dominated by salt marshes. And in areas that are warm enough, mangroves outcompete salt marshes and are the most common coastal wetland vegetation. So this map shows the 3 different species of mangroves we have in our region. It shows the mangroves in green, and then it also shows these range expansion hotspots. Those are the black ovals. Those are areas where the northern range limit of mangroves has been expanding. In Florida, where I think a lot of the people on the call are probably from Florida, there's been range expansion near Cedar Key in Apalachicola, and that involves 2 species, and then also on the Atlantic coast in Jacksonville. In Texas, we had a recent freeze event that resulted in some contraction in 2021. You may have heard about it in the news. A lot of people lost power. And in Louisiana, we've had expansion since the last freeze event in 1989. So in Louisiana, Florida, the last major freeze event was in 1989, and there's been expansion since then. So one early question related to the mangrove range limit was, what's the temperature tipping point for mangrove range expansion? And I'm going to talk about that because it led to the work that I'm going to be talking about related to invasive species. And so an early effort in 2013, this is how I got started working on this topic, was identifying this tipping point where salt marshes are replaced by mangrove forests. And so we used a simple combination of data, so gridded minimum temperature data in combination with coastal wetland data. And from the coastal wetland data, we calculated this percentage of coastal wetlands dominated by mangrove forests. So that's the y-axis in this figure. And the result was striking. So it's this really nice sigmoidal logistic curve with this strong temperature response. And the derivatives from that equation, the first derivative shows that the inflection point is -7 degrees C. And then the second derivatives highlight this zone of instability, or the threshold zone. I may call it the threshold zone, zone of instability, or sometimes the area of maximum rate of change that falls between -7.6 and -6.3. And what was nice about this is so we published this in 2013, and since then we've had a few local moderate freeze events where we've been able to test this threshold, and field-based observations of mortality and damage show that this threshold is in the right ballpark. So we're confident that this simple approach in our region was effective. And I'm gonna go back to that approach because we took that approach for a lot of the invasive species in the data that I'm going to present in the third section. Okay, so why is this important? So in coastal wetlands, foundation plant species play an important role. They're species that create habitat, they modulate ecosystem processes, and they facilitate the development of entire ecological communities. And coastal wetlands are often ranked by environmental economists as some of the most valuable ecosystems on the planet. And that's due to the many different ecosystem services that they support. Those services include coastal protection, carbon sequestration, fish and wildlife habitat, water quality improvement. They provide seafood, coastal food, they support coastal food webs, and lots of recreational opportunities. And so a shift due to range expansion, in this case, a shift from salt marsh to mangrove, has important implications for some of these ecosystem goods and services. This happens to be a situation where there's some positive effects and some negative effects. There's some trade-offs, and we have a review paper focused on those trade-offs. But within the context of invasive species range expansion, there's also going to be those trade-offs too. So it's something that's important to keep in mind. Okay, so that was the introduction section. And now I'm going to transition to a study focused on Brazilian pepper. And this is essentially taking that same approach that we use for mangroves, but applying it to Brazilian pepper. And this was published in a paper a few years ago in 2019. And my co-author in this paper is Lafayette, who's also at the USGS Wetland and Aquatic Research Center in Lafayette. And a little bit of background regarding Brazilian pepper. So Brazilian pepper has become the most widespread invasive plant species in Florida. It was introduced from Brazil as an ornamental plant in the 1800s. It escaped cultivation in the mid-1900s and has now spread across much of South and Central Florida. And this map shows its occurrence data for Brazilian pepper. Brazilian pepper has many traits that allow it to be highly invasive. For example, prolific fruit production, short generation times, long distance seed dispersal by birds, high seedling survivorship, and rapid recovery following disturbance. Once established, Brazilian pepper outcompetes native plant species to form nearly monospecific forests that transform ecosystems and have negative effects on wildlife habitat. Millions of dollars are spent each year in Florida managing Brazilian pepper. And so this slide shows two photos of Brazilian pepper on the left. The figure on the right shows the distribution of Brazilian pepper in Florida. The background colors are the minimum temperatures recorded during a 30-year period, much like the maps that I've been showing in previous slides. And then the species data on this map are from a database called EDD Maps, which is based at the University of Georgia. And I'm going to be showing a lot of figures that incorporate data from EDD Maps. The temperature data in this slide are from the PRISM climate group at Oregon State. And so here's a very similar relationship to what I showed for mangroves. So on the x-axis, we have minimum temperature from -30 degrees C to 5 degrees C. And on the y-axis, we have Brazilian pepper presence and a binary response, yes or no. And then there's the logistic regression. And we use the same derivative approach to identify these thresholds. And so the threshold for Brazilian pepper was identified to be somewhere around -11 degrees C. And when we initially submitted this paper, one of the reviewers in the first round of comments recommended that we get field observations of damage to Brazilian pepper, which was a really helpful suggestion. And it prompted us to do that. And so I sent emails across the region asking people if they had seen any Brazilian pepper damage or mortality. And I got a lot of responses. This is something that a lot of people have observed and they had real specific information about. And so this is a table that shows some of those observations. And so there's different columns. One column is location. The next column is the year of the freeze event, the minimum temperature during that event, and then there's freeze damage observations. And the paper itself has more detailed freeze damage observations, including the extent of recovery and resprouting. And then the last column is the observer. And what was really neat about accumulating and getting all these observations was we could use them to gauge whether the threshold we identified is within the right ballpark. And it appears to be it appears to be in the ballpark. So here, this table shows that minor damage to Brazilian pepper occurred between -1 and -4, and then the moderate to major damage occurred at -6 to -7. And so we can use that information to create these maps regarding where Brazilian pepper may be in the future. And this is just based upon climate, and it's just some real simple scenarios, a +2, a +4, and a +6. So we have 4 different panels. The top is the recent 1980 to 2009, and then the +2, +4, and +6. And the colors reflect the probability of Brazilian pepper presence in 25% increments. So the darker reds, the probability of presence there is 75 to 100%. And so these maps just show that with climate change, and specifically warming winter temperatures, decreases in the frequency and intensity of these extreme winter temperatures would allow Brazilian peppers to expand into these other states. Okay, so that's the Brazilian pepper section. And now I'm going to move on to this third theme, which is really the new research. And it's from a paper that's currently in review. It's entitled Range Expansion of Tropical Invasive Plants Due to Warming Winters. And again, the co-authors on this study are Bogdan Kivui, Laura Feher, Leah Dale, Dia Lawrence, Wes Daniel, and Jessica Spencer. And I should also point out that the work that I'm presenting, parts of it were funded by the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, especially the first theme, and other parts have been funded by the USGS Climate research and development program. And then I also get funding from the USGS Greater Everglades Priority Ecosystem Science Programs. And this last section, the USGS Invasive Species Program. So different pieces of what I've presented have been funded by different parts of USGS. Okay, so background for this last theme. So Florida is a hotspot for biological invasions. And I think for those in Florida, you know this, but it is a global hotspot. It's been highlighted as a global hotspot for biological invasions. Many ecosystems in Florida have been transformed by invasive plants, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and other taxa. And I want to be clear that here I'm really referring to species that have been introduced from other parts of the world and thrived. Many of these species are tropical cold sensitive species. So they're species that are affected by these chilling events in South Florida or extreme freeze events in North Florida. And lastly, lots of money, time, and resources are used to manage these invasive species. So the research questions were, okay, so we've got mangroves are sensitive to cold, Brazilian pepper sensitive to cold. There's documentation in the literature that all these other problematic invasive species in Florida are sensitive to cold. So there's documentation that they've been damaged by a specific cold event or even died following a specific cold event. So our hypothesis was that a high percentage of these invasive plant species are tropical cold sensitive species whose northern limit in their introduced range, their new range, is governed in some way by these extreme freeze events, and under warm winters, they would have the potential to expand northward. So that's the general idea, and these are specific research questions. So first, what is the sensitivity of the region's tropical invasive plant species to freezing temperatures? And then second, what is the potential for northward range expansion under alternative future climate scenarios? And for the focal plant species, so we started with a list of 81 species, and this was produced by the Florida Invasive Species Council, FISP. They're formerly known as the Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council, and they have these list of species. And so we started with the Category 1 list of invasive plant species, which was published in 2019. And these are species that are altering native plant communities by displacing native species, changing community structures or ecological functions, or hybridizing with natives. And we also incorporated information from the University of Florida's IFAS's assessment of non-native plants. And here's our hypothesis. I think you've seen several figures like this. This was our hypothesized relationship between minimum temperature and tropical invasive plant presence. So in essence, we're trying to do the same thing for all these 81 species that we did for Brazilian pepper and black mangroves. And so we accumulated extreme winter temperature data, we gathered invasive plant presence data, and then we expected to see this sigmoidal logistic relationship. And what we really wanted to do was, beyond just the relationship, identify that inflection point. So test whether there was a clear threshold, and then identify that threshold zone. So the threshold zone is the area between those two red lines, and the absolute threshold is the inflection point, that dotted line. And so for threshold zone, sometimes I call it the AMRC, which is the area of maximum rate of change. And it's calculated from the second derivatives of that equation. Okay. So moving on to results. So of those 81 species, I thought we'd be able to get data and identify thresholds for maybe 5 or 10 species, but we were able to identify temperature thresholds for 40 of those 81 species. And the temperature thresholds range from -16 to -1 degree C. So in other words, there's the species that are present in North Florida would be in this north group. Those are species that have temperature thresholds between -16 and -11 degrees C. And there were 15 species in that category. There are species whose northern range is limited to Central Florida. That's the mid group. And there were 11 species in that group, and their threshold was between -11 and -6 degrees C. And then there were 14 species in the south group. So those are species whose range limit is limited to South Florida, and their threshold was between -6 and -1 degrees C. And I'm not going to go over all 40 species, but if anybody's interested, I can send them that preliminary table. Again, this is from a paper that's still under review. So that's why this section of the talk has that disclaimer on the bottom, that this information is preliminary and subject to revision. It's because the paper is still in review. But here are 9 examples. So these are 9 examples that we selected, and they're organized from most cold tolerant in the upper left to least cold tolerant in the lower right. And each panel represents an example species. Temperatures in the background are the PRISM data, the absolute minimum temperature from 1981 to 2010. And then the species occurrence data is shown with those stars, and that species occurrence data is from EDD maps. And the 9 species that we selected were air potato, narrow sword fern, Brazilian pepper, melaleuca, elephant grass, Australian pine, Suriname cherry, Ehrlichiaceae, and sapodilla, or sapodillo, I don't know how you pronounce that one. And then, and so you can see that the occurrence data reflect that cold tolerance. So from moving from upper left to lower right, if you look at those stars, you can see that the distribution corresponds with their cold tolerance. And here are the results, those threshold and sigmoidal relationships for those same 9 species organized in the exact same way. And as you'd expect based upon their distribution, the thresholds are to the left. They're colder in the upper left panel, and then they're warmer in the lower right panel. And in this figure, we have T, which is the inflection point, and then AMRC is that threshold zone. So that's the zone between the 2 vertical lines. So for example, for air potato, the threshold was identified as -13.9, and then the threshold zone is between -15.3 and -12.6. So, so we identified thresholds for all of those 40 species, and these provide an initial guess or estimate of the cold tolerance of these species. Now, again, just like for mangroves and Brazilian pepper, these thresholds need to be tested and validated with field observations of damage, but they provide an initial guess of where that threshold would be. But greenhouse experiments, manipulative field experiments, or even better, I think the best way to validate these thresholds is with field observations following a freeze event. And for mangroves, we have a coordinated network across the region where when we have a freeze event, we communicate and collaborate together to go out and get data. And collectively, we've found a lot of power in gathering consistent data across the entire region following freeze events and across climatic gradients. That's really helped to refine these thresholds. So that's something that could be done for these invasive species, is following a freeze event like the one we had in December for certain species. A lot of people go out in the field and collect data in the same way to test and refine these temperature thresholds. So, okay, so results. In terms of the UF IFAS assessment categories, of the 40 species, 12 are on the prohibited list or prohibited category. 18 are in the invasive category. 2 species are in the high invasion risk category. 7 species are in the caution category. And 1 species is in the assessment and process category. So this gives some indication of how the state of Florida in this specific assessment has assessed the risk for these species. And in the figure, we've got different maps of potential range expansion. So here's maps of the, it shouldn't say predicted, it should be potential range expansion of species groups under alternative future scenarios. And here we have the same scenarios, a 2, a 4, and a 6. And these are just a 2 and 4 and a 6 above the recent conditions. And the recent is the top panel. And in the other panels, we have 5 different colors. The blue is beyond the range limit of all these species. So the blue is too cold for any of the species that we studied. There's like a yellow orange, and that's the north group species. So that's the range limit for those species that are in the north group. The peach is the range limit for the species that were in that mid group. and the red is the range limit for species that were in that south group. And so under recent conditions, you can see that the north group is in North Florida, the mid group is in Central Florida, and the red group is in South Florida. That darker color, the maroon color, is the range core. So that's an area where based upon climate and not extreme hot temperatures, we didn't incorporate that, but just based upon winter climate, that's the area where all 40 species could potentially be. So if you go through the alternative scenarios, you can see that the yellow, orange, the peach, and the red move further north and across the region in response to these different scenarios. Highlighted in the take-home message, which is that under accelerating climate change and specifically winter warming, there's the potential for these invasive plant species to spread outside of their current distribution in Florida northward into adjacent states, which has all sorts of management and ecological implications. And so the management, how is this information useful, especially from a management perspective? Well, first of all, one of the most relevant uses is this early detection rapid response. So this information can be used to identify species and also areas within and just north of current range limits that may be vulnerable to range expansion of these species. And with that information, managers can decide what they want to do and whether they want to employ a rapid response management action. And then the other one, which always seems so simple, is this preemptive regulations. For example, a species that's regulated in Florida and has the potential to expand northward into Georgia and Alabama, there may be some value and some preemptive regulations to prevent the sale, transport, and planting of these species in areas north of their current range limit. And that could even be within different regions in Florida too. So these are the two easiest aspects of the management utility. And in general, I just got back from a workshop last week, which focused on the RAD framework. So it's RAD stands for Resist, Accept, Direct. And they're real simple ways to think about the effects of climate change and our management actions in response to those effects. And I think there's value in this context too. Most of the way I think about it is in coastal wetland responses to climate change and sea level rise, but within the context of invasive species management, this information can be used to inform efforts to resist change using management actions, accept change and not use any management actions, let that change happen. Or the third is direct change with management actions. And so I think that this information can inform efforts to use RAD within an invasive species context as well. So, all right, so thanks for bearing with me. I'm almost done. And so the take-home messages for this talk is that there are many invasive species in Florida that are tropical cold sensitive species. So they're species whose northern range limits are governed by extreme chill-in or freeze events. And these species have the potential to expand northward due to climate change, specifically warm and winter temperatures. And then second, there's a need to better anticipate and prepare for the northward range expansion of these invasive plants from Florida into adjacent states in the southeastern United States. And that's it. Thanks so much for the invitation to present, Brett. And thanks to everyone who attended the webinar as well. I think we have plenty of time for questions, but if your question isn't covered, just please send me an email and I'm happy to chat.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Mike. So any questions, you can either go ahead and ask, or you could send your questions via chat. So starting at the top, which species of mangrove is increasing? So that was kind of directed towards the beginning of your talk.
Yeah, good. That's a good question. And so we have three species in our region: the black mangrove, red mangrove, and white mangrove. And the black mangrove is the most freeze tolerant. So it's the species that has spread furthest north. And so it's present and abundant in parts of Louisiana and Texas. The other species are less freeze tolerant. That's the red mangrove and the white mangrove. But I will say that in Florida is unique. It's different from Louisiana and Texas. And then in Apalachicola, there's red mangrove that has expanded in addition to the black mangrove. So Apalachicola is a region that kind of has surprised the mangrove ecologists in our region in that it has both species expanding, and white mangrove has been. They've also the answer is all three have been expanding, but they've been expanding in different areas and at different rates. But the black mangrove is the species that we see furthest north.
We have another question here. Have you had success with encouraging preemptive regulations? And if so, how did you go about it?
I have not, and I have not really tried to, but I'm sure there's plenty of people on this call that could answer that question. But no, I haven't tried to examine those preemptive regulations, but I'd be glad to have that conversation if anyone is interested in following up on that.
So another question was basically saying that the use of this minimum temperature threshold seems to be very informative. Has there been any work done for similar ecological variables like max or min precipitation?
Yeah, that's a good question. This is a really, I think that we're fortunate in our region that the range limit of these species is so strongly governed by these extreme freeze events that this really simple approach is valuable. And it's those field observations of damage and range expansion and contraction. Like for mangroves, for example, we can pinpoint specific periods of range expansion and contraction to freeze events and the absence of freeze events. And so we're in a region where this simple approach is very powerful. Now, your point about interactions between other variables is very important. So a good example would be for coastal wetlands. Precipitation, if there's not enough rainfall, not enough freshwater inflow, it'll be too salty for mangroves or salt marsh. And so there's parts of our country, for example, Texas, where it's so salty that the marshes are dominated by succulent plants, or it's too salty for plants at all. And so, yes, there is definitely value in incorporating other variables and other aspects of climate change. And climate change is complicated, but these interactions are really important. That said, for the case of tropical cold sensitive species, I think there's a lot of power in these real simple analyses.
I actually have a follow-up since you're talking about the threshold. I'm going to jump in because it seems like it's a good continuation. So it seems like you were encouraging regarding this threshold to complement the threshold approach with some observations of damage. And I'm assuming that's why you did it via the review. The reviewer probably was like, well, how do we know the threshold is real?
Exactly.
And did you use, so in this paper that's in review, did you use any other, outside of documenting evidence of damage, did you use any other ways to try to validate the threshold?
That's a good question, Brett.
And I'm thinking specifically in terms of invasive species, which are like, they're in non-equilibrium. And so, they're constantly expanding. And so some might be, some might not be.
Yeah. Yes, that's a good question. So we tried to get data, but it's 40 species. And I think with Brazilian pepper, we were successful because we were trying to get data for just one species. And so it was real tangible. We got a lot of responses. For these 40 species, I think it just overwhelmed people. And I got some observations. I did get a lot of valuable observations, but not enough to be a robust part of the manuscript. And so they're not incorporated. What I think I think targeted requests regarding specific species would be effective. But I think the most powerful approach, I mentioned this coordinated networks, I think there would be a lot of value in Florida specifically for these regional coordinated networks. So these would be individuals near the northern range limit for these species. For example, let's say Brazilian pepper or whatever species. There's a lot of managers and scientists that work near these range limits. If there is a freeze event, I think the best approach is to have these people ready to go out and make some observations, coordinated, consistent observations, and to have someone accumulate that data and synthesize it. I think that's the best way to refine these temperature thresholds.
So you couldn't have answered that better, because the First Coast Invasive Working Group asked what observations should be taken.
Oh, okay. So and I'll refer to mangroves specifically, and I think it'd be a lot similar for these other species too. The first observation would be damage. So percent damage. And for mangroves, we have a SOP for this actually. It's customized to mangroves. But the first step would be to go out following the freeze event in the initial days, initial weeks, even the initial months, to estimate the damage to the plant. And if there is damage, that can be useful for identifying thresholds for damage. But a lot of these species can resprout, and so they can lose their above ground biomass and then resprout and recover fairly rapidly. Brazilian pepper and black mangrove are good examples. And so beyond just damage, I think there's a lot of value in the damage data. But if we can get folks to go out later on at the end of the growing season to quantify mortality, that's also valuable. And so if that data is collected across a gradient in temperatures, that's where we can really refine these temperature thresholds. And it's pretty easy to do. And I found that people are really excited to collaborate in that way. It just takes someone that can organize the information.
And there are two kind of follow-up questions that are similar. So I'm going to read them both because they complement each other. So the first is, has anyone tested the viability of Brazilian pepper seeds that have been frost bitten? And then the kind of the follow-up to this is, do you anticipate that some species are becoming locally adapted to frost tolerance? Or is northern range expansion simply due to warming winters?
Mm-hmm. Those are both really good questions. Regarding Brazilian pepper, the first question, I can't think of anybody that's done that. I do know of a student in Texas that has a really good data set regarding freeze damage, mortality, recovery following the freeze event, but that doesn't help with your specific question. The second question is really, really good one too. And that has to do with whether species are, and correct me if I'm wrong, whether species are adapting and building cold tolerance. And yes, that's definitely true. For black mangroves that are adapted to South Florida have a lower cold tolerance than those that are in North Florida. And there's even physiological traits that are different between the two. And that happens pretty quickly. So if you go out after a freeze, you may see 50% of individuals that are affected, and then another 50% that aren't affected at all. And so there's definitely some selection that's occurring near those northern range limits. I think that relates to the second question.
Here's a more general question. Are there general, and i.e. not species specific, confounding environmental factors that may encourage or limit expansion? For example, soil quality, moisture availability.
Yes, I love that question. Yeah, microclimate especially is very important. And other soil quality too. Yeah, there's studies for mangroves that have shown that nutrient enrichment can affect that cold sensitivity. And microclimate is really important for all these species. So, I mean, I could go on and on for mangroves. So for mangroves, I'll give some examples, but I think this is relevant for all these other species too. For a lot of these species, if they're closer to the coast, they're going to be in microclimates that are warmer just due to the water, the ocean water. And for mangroves, there's microclimates due to the soil. And so you can have a 10 degree C difference in just the first half meter above the soil. And what that does is it buffers against, so it protects propagules and short plants. Yes, microclimate and those other abiotic factors that affect cold tolerance. That's very interesting. And that's an area of research that very few people have focused on. So that's another excellent question. We've got good questions here, Brett.
Yeah, great questions. And here's another good one. How do you think biological control effectiveness for a select number of species will be impacted by range expansion?
Biological control efforts?
Yeah, so how will they be impacted by the expansion of some of
So I would say that near northern range limits and just beyond them. Oh, biological control. That question has to do with insects, huh? Or, right? You said biological control.
Yes. How do you think biological control?
I don't know. I haven't thought about
for
that.
Dioscorea, for example.
Yeah, I have not thought about that. And I guess there could be, yeah, I don't know. I guess the cold could also affect those insects. But
Well, sorry, I should have followed up with the second question here because it's a two-part question. Do the invert cold tolerance just track with the plants, or is that unknown?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure there are some people that have thought about that, but I'm not prepared to answer that question. In that review paper, there is a whole section on insects. So these cold events definitely control the range limits of insects as well. But they'd probably be different than the plants. So that's another really good question.
Okay, let's see. Are you able to share the SOPs for the mangrove damage documentation?
Yeah, I can. Just whoever that is, just send me an email and I can share it with you.
And you could, in just Googling your name, you could find the email on your USGS webpage.
Yes, it's mosland@usgs.gov.
Perfect.
So mosland@usgs.gov. I can put it in the chat.
Would you provide the protocol used to this participant list for assessing damage thresholds? So,
yeah, I can. And I can provide specific papers as examples too.
Great. Okay, so Miami-Dade County's DERM-EEL program is currently doing a temperature study with USGS. Is it possible for someone to send me the presentation? Oh, I didn't read the question before. For this person, I can send the presentation. So we will also be posting. So we have a new website going to be launched in the next week or two. And if you join the listserv, we will be sending out the announcements, and all of this will be uploaded onto the new website for Southeast RISC. So a lot of this information will be available there. All right, I need to make sure I read the questions before I read them out loud. Okay, so is your team creating protocol or conducting research, creating protocols or conducting research regarding invasion and damage thresholds after hurricanes and natural disasters?
We do a lot of work related to hurricanes, and yeah, but I wouldn't say specifically within the context of damage thresholds for hurricanes or natural disasters. So I guess it depends. It's yes to part of that question, but maybe not all of it.
Okay. Well, that was a great round of questioning.
Yeah, I agree.
We're at 1:53. We have maybe a minute or two for more questions if anyone has them. Okay. Well, Mike, thank you. Mike, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your work. Really appreciate your time, and thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. And stay tuned for our upcoming webinar schedule for the new year. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Brett.